Hey guys, this is John. We're going to have a look at Game 6 from the 2018 World Chess Championship. I got my coffee. I hope you guys do too. We're going to need it this game. So, Magnus with the white pieces again. He's got the double whites here in this game and the next game. And he decides to open with e4 this time. He's been trying a different white move in every game. He opened with d4 in Game 2, c4 in Game 4, and now e4. And one of the big questions heading into this match was, would Fabiano defend his favorite Petrov defense if Magnus opened with e4? And we got the answer to that in this game because they went right for the Petrov. So Fabiano not backing down from his favorite defense, knight f6 here on move 2. Knight takes e5 was played, and now Fabiano played d6. Some of you may be wondering, why does black not take the pawn on e4? Isn't that the logical thing to do to try to get the material back? But you learn a hard lesson if you decide to mirror your opponents early on in your chess career. White can play queen e2, and if black continues copying, then black ends up losing the game. Queen takes e4, queen takes e5, white can take the queen, and mirroring, copying your opponent is not a good strategy. Also, if after queen e2, black moves the attack knight, then white has this discovered attack, knight c6 check. I used to give simuls a little less so nowadays, and I've won many, many games like this from chess amateurs. So these guys have known that since they were in Pampers. So Fabiano plays d6, kicking the knight. And now Magnus plays an unusual move. The main line is knight f3. And then after knight takes e4, there are various lines, d4 being one of the most prominent ones. You occasionally see knight c4 here, but I was actually not aware that the move that Magnus Carlsen played in this position was really playable or at all a try for an advantage. But he played knight d3. Weird looking retreat for the knight, so blocking the d-pawn. But there was some preparation behind that, of course. So knight takes e4, queen e2, pinning the knight. Fabiano breaks the pin, queen e7. Note that black would not want to try to play d5 or f5 because white can play f3, and that knight is going to be mortally pinned and will be lost soon. So queen e7 is a better idea. And now Magnus played another knight move, knight f4. The theme of especially the early part of this game was knight moves. And you'll see in particular, one of black's knights gets a real workout, this knight. So knight f4. So now there's the threat of knight d5 looking to attack the queen and also c7. And you could see that black's queen might be overloaded if white was able to land that move because black would have to defend the knight and try to defend that pawn. But there is a tactical solution here. Fabiano played knight c6. Magnus played knight d5. And now this move knight d4. So black has allowed white to jump in with the knight, but immediately counterattacks knight d4, hitting the white queen. And I was listening to Alexander Grishuk talk about this line, and he said he had discussed this with a grandmaster colleague of him. And apparently this move knight d4, in his words, kills this variation for white. And this is backed up by the computer. This is definitely a computer-approved line. It looks kind of crazy to play this way, but let's consider what happened. So white took black up on the offer. White has the first jump here and can therefore try to play something threatening. I don't think knight takes c7 would be a concern because black can play king d8. And all of a sudden, white has multiple pieces under attack. White definitely doesn't have time to take the rook in the corner because white's queen is hanging. The idea of knight takes c7, by the way, would be if queen takes c7, queen takes e4 check, white trying to win a pawn. But that's not working. So Magnus played in principled fashion. He took on e7. Fabiano takes white's queen. Now Magnus backs up the knight to d5, hitting the pawn on c7, also threatening this knight here. Note that this bishop on c1 is hanging, but after knight takes c7, white will gather the rook in the corner, and this knight is trapped. Very unusual position here with a knight on c1. I don't think I've ever seen that so early in a game. But the tactics are all, again, computer approved. Knight d5 is the correct way for white to play this. And likewise for black, bringing the knight back to d4 and threatening a counter check and a counter fork of his own. So now Magnus played knight a3. We can explore knight takes c7 here very briefly, but knight takes c7 check, king d8, knight takes a8. Black is going to continue with knight takes c2 check, king here, and take on a1. And this appears to be pretty balanced. Both sides have far-flung knights that are very likely to be lost. Also, white has to contend with this threat. So if anyone's better here, it may be black in view of knight takes f2. White doesn't have a complementary threat on f7. Probably this line can be improved. So after knight takes c7 check, bishop d3 could be played by white. I was briefly exploring with the help of the engine, kind of an in-between move trying to attack this knight and simultaneously defend c2. White is up a pawn at the moment, and there's a line, knight takes f2, king takes f2, king takes c7, and this looks roughly equal. Yeah, if you're interested in the tactical complications, I'd recommend playing these lines out with the engine, but they work out to rough equality. No concerns for black. Another variation is after this knight d4 move, if white plays bishop d3 immediately, black can play knight c5, move the attack knight, this time attacking the bishop on d3. You wouldn't want to go for knight takes f2 here because white's knight is not hanging yet. It hasn't captured on c7 yet, but knight c5, and now if white goes for this, it's actually a pretty similar story. White can go after that rook in the corner, but after takes, eventual knight c2, take the rook. Here, white even has an extra pawn, but black appears to be fine. Black has the bishop pair. Again, this knight very likely to be lost. Black is definitely holding his own here. So after this knight d4 move, Magnus declined to go into these knight hopping variations where the rooks end up getting captured, and he played knight a3, developing and defending the c2 pawn. And another knight move from Fabiano, he plays knight back to e6, guarding the pawn on c7. Magnus played f3. Very unusual opening, as you can tell. This knight moved back to c5. And now white gets to play a couple tempi moves. So f3 on the previous move hitting the knight, and now d4 again hitting the knight. Note that black can't play knight takes d4 because of knight takes c7 with the fork, and c2 remains defended. But no matter, Fabiano goes back to d7. And I think Fabiano had this line very well worked out because you can imagine white playing this knight d3 variation. If you weren't prepared, it seems like there's a lot of weird tactical nuances, but yeah, Fabiano seemed to have this well under control. So you can bet that this was part of his preparation, which I will say is important because there was that video that was leaked a few days ago, I believe after game 3, featuring Fabiano at his training camp. It was on the St. Louis Chess Club channel. It caused some big drama in the chess world, where for a few seconds in the video, there was shots of Fabiano's preparation. There was a chess-based file and shots showing various lines that Fabiano plays. One of them was the Petrov. Not a huge secret that Fabiano plays the Petrov, but I think psychologically it was very nice for Fabiano to play it in this game and come out of the opening in good shape. So we're not out of the opening quite yet, but he seemed to know what he was doing, and Magnus's prep, this knight d3 line, didn't really amount to much. So knight d7, Magnus played c3, a nice solidifying move defending the d4 pawn. Again, knight takes d4 is not a threat yet for black, but this is useful in the future. Also may allow the knight to come back to c2. And now Fabiano played c6, kicking Magnus's knight this time. Knight f4, knight b6. This is a nice move to allow black to take with the bishop on e6. Bishop d3. And now d5. So we have a nearly symmetric pawn structure. The only difference is white has played f3. And now bishop takes a3 could be in the air. So Magnus routes the knight to c2. Fabiano develops, bishop d6. Knight takes e6, bishop takes e6. And now after that initial excitement, the queens were traded pretty early. There were some tactical nuances, but we are left with, I would say, a queenless middle game. I hesitate to call this an endgame because there's a ton of play left, a lot of pieces left, but a queenless middle game where, I got to be honest, when I was doing my thing in the morning, I was paying attention to the game just off and on, and I thought this was headed towards another draw. I really thought, okay, this game, it's on move 17, but I wouldn't be surprised if shortly after move 30, the players will agree a draw. There will be some trades. You can offer a draw in the match after move 30. So I wasn't really expecting this to lead to too much for either side. But we were in for much more here. So Magnus played king f2. He could castle. I think castling is still legal. I don't think white has moved his king or his rook yet, and he's not castling through check or out of check. But keeping the king in the center may be useful. Good rule of thumb is that the queens have been traded in a position, it's okay to keep your king in the center. So king f2 was possible. Castling was possible, but he prefers to play king f2 a little bit closer to the middle of the board. And now Fabiano played h5. This is an interesting little space gaining move, stopping white from expanding with g4, also maybe trying to encroach with h4 later on. Magnus responds with h4, stopping any ideas that black had with advancing. And now Fabiano reroutes this knight. So originally he moved the knight to b6 to make way for the bishop to come out. But now he plays knight c8, and he's going to look to put that knight on e7 most likely. Knight e3 was played. I actually think this might have been a slight inaccuracy, this knight e3 move. His idea, Magnus would like to play g3, knight g2, and then use the f4 square probably for his bishop, and maybe eventually get the knight there. But I think it would have been better to play, let's say, g3, play this first, knight e7, and then rook e1, centralize, and keep his options open, because you'll see in a second that he really is lacking defense over the d4 square when he puts his knight on e3. But nevertheless, knight e3, Fabiano plays knight e7, g3, and now I think an excellent decision by Fabiano, and this gave this game a lot of spice. So he decides to try to change the pawn structure. He plays c5, advancing and accepting a potential isolated pawn. So Magnus has the option of taking, but after bishop takes c5, it looks like black can always get rid of the pawn with d4 if he so chooses, and white's temporarily inconvenienced. This knight on e3 is pinned. If white plays king g2, that takes away the square that you wanted to route the knight to. So I don't think this is exactly what Magnus would like. He could think about giving a check here, perhaps trying to make the black king move, but Magnus at this point, I think he was a little bit disturbed by the c5 idea. He played bishop c2, and I again kind of question whether that move was necessary. I don't quite see the purpose of it. It might allow him with rook d1 to be able to defend the d4 pawn a little bit easier, but it looks like kind of a wishy-washy move. So now Fabiano castles. He keeps the tension with the pawns, just gets his king to safety. Magnus plays rook d1, rook fd8, and now knight g2. There's sort of a question mark as far as Magnus's development, how he's going to complete it, because Fabiano has managed to complete his development, got his king castled and his rooks coordinated. By the way, the reason I think Fabiano castled versus keeping his king in the center is that he would have had to put his king on d7 otherwise, and with Magnus's rook potentially coming to d1, that looked kind of awkward on that file, so it makes more sense to castle, even though I was saying the kings are okay in the center after the queens have been traded. But yeah, Magnus has to figure out how to get this dark square bishop into the game, so he plays knight g2, and again, he's dreaming of playing bishop f4 and trying to induce a trade and get his knight up here, or possibly knight f4 even without the trade of the bishops first. But now Fabiano captures, and it's annoying for Magnus that he can't even consider rook takes d4 trying to saddle black with that isolated pawn, because this time it flat out loses to bishop c5 with the pin, winning the exchange. So c takes d4. Now both sides have an isolated d-pawn. Fabiano plays a tempo move, rook a c8, hitting the bishop on c2. Magnus plays bishop b3, knight c6. And Magnus gets his wish. He gets to play bishop f4. But this knight, which has been jumping all over the board so far, is jumping even more. Knight a5, putting some pressure on the bishop on b3. And now Magnus played rook dc1. If he decides to take on d6 instead, so let's say he just initiates this trade, then it's very important that Fabiano can insert this capture on b3. Knight takes b3. And after a takes b3, there's rook c2 check, king g1, rook takes d6. And black is for choice here, because if we continue the line a little bit further, rook takes a7 is possible, but now black can play this nice move, rook b6, defending b7 and going after b3. b2 is also hanging. White's king is stuck on the back rank for now. Black's definitely more active and will get the material back. Black is for choice here. So that's why Magnus can't blindly continue to, or try to trade pieces here and hope to stabilize the situation. Already after knight a5, he's in danger of being worse. And of course, if you're black, you don't want to cooperate and play bishop takes f4 and allow your opponent's knight to come into the game, because then Fabiano would immediately have to address that pawn on h5. So very smart of him not to initiate the trade on f4. Let his opponent come to him if he wants to make that trade. So knight a5, and Magnus played this move, rook dc1. I think he chose that rook because in some lines after knight takes b3, a takes b3, it's very helpful for the rook to attack the a7 pawn. Slows black down a little bit. And there wasn't as much pressure on d4 now, so he can afford to play rook dc1. So this was played. And now a nice move by Fabiano, which again kind of crosses Magnus's plans of eventually trying to get this knight to f4 after a trade of the bishops. So he plays bishop b4. Normally a bishop in the opponent's half of the board like this can be easily kicked with a pawn, so a3. But notice there's this hanging bishop on b3 for the moment, so that's not possible for white at the moment. And by playing this way, I think black is, in a sense, questioning this knight on g2. Like, how are you going to get the knight to f4 if your bishop's there and I'm stopping a trade? So, annoying for white. Now Magnus played bishop d1. He was critical of this decision after the game. I watched the press conference, and very interesting press conference. I would highly recommend checking it out. I'll drop a link. But he said he should have played bishop c7 here. And he said he would have been a little bit worse in the resulting positions, but he thinks he could have made a draw pretty easily. Bishop c7 forcing a trade on b3 because of the double attack here. Or perhaps not forcing a trade because it is defended by the bishop, but suffice it to say, he was critical of this bishop d1 move, and indeed, after this, he starts to experience some concrete problems. So, he played this bishop d1 move, and Fabiano jumps into c4, so there's no longer really a purpose for the knight on a5. There's no bishop here to attack. But now he can come to c4, and you'll see he begins posing small problems to Magnus with every single move here. So this one hits the pawn on b2. So Magnus plays b3, kicking the knight. Knight a3. And now white doesn't want this rook stuck on a1 anymore. It has no future at this point. It's never going to be able to attack a7. So Magnus decides to trade. And then a typical pressure relieving operation. I've talked about this in a previous game, actually. I believe it was game 4. Trying to swap rooks. And indeed, the rooks soon came off the board. But first, Fabiano plays knight b5, bringing the knight back into the action and threatening the d4 pawn. So Magnus trades. And now he plays knight e3. So it's kind of tempting to play bishop e3 in this position. But note that this knight has other destinations. He's attacking d4, but he also has the option of knight c3, attacking the bishop and the pawn on a2. So if a move like knight c3 was not possible, I think Magnus would easily be able to coordinate his pieces. Maybe he'll finally get that desired knight f4 move in, which would hit both of these points and probably draw without much effort. But again, there's small problems being posed to Magnus by Fabiano on every move here. So he tries to counterattack. He plays knight e3. Giving up on the whole knight f4 idea, but hitting the pawn on d5. And now knight c3 is played. This is still a nice move because it combines defense as well as attack. Magnus plays bishop c2. And if knight takes a2, knight takes d5 could be played. But Fabiano is going to try to twist the knife a little bit first. He plays bishop a3. And black has the idea of trying to play bishop e6, guarding that pawn, and only then playing knight takes a2. And note the importance of bishop a3. Magnus actually talked about bishop a3 a couple times. He mentions that he missed it on 2 occasions in this game. Bishop a3 is important here because if black plays bishop e6 immediately, white can play a4, advancing the attacked pawn, and now white has to defend b3 at all times, but b3 is much harder for black to attack comparative to a2. So bishop a3, the idea again of bishop e6, defending d5, overprotecting d5, and trying to threaten the pawn on a2, which can't be defended by the bishop because black also controls that square. So really Medusa knight for black in this game. So Magnus, he's a resourceful guy. He plays bishop b8. He's trying to drum up counterplay. He hits this pawn on a7. We got this minor piece duel going on. So black plays pawn a6. And now Magnus takes this opportunity to play f4. And why did he play f4? Well, he's trying to be disruptive. If that bishop lands on e6, he can kick it away with f5. Nice idea. So trying to disrupt black's plan of playing knight takes a2 smoothly when d5 is overprotected. Also, by advancing the f-pawn, he creates this option for bishop d1 to try to attack this pawn on h5. So he's trying to play actively in defense. But Fabiano plays bishop d7, so he's adjusting his plan a little bit. He says, all right, if you're going to cover e6, make sure if I play bishop e6, you hit me with f5. I'll just go to c6 instead. That way, one of your pawns can't attack my bishop. I'll still be defending d5, and I'll finally be threatening this knight takes a2 move, trying to win a pawn. So Magnus plays f5. Also was possible to play bishop d1 immediately here. Maybe looking to route the bishop to f3 in the case that black plays, let's say, g6, trying to go after d5. But on a couple occasions this game, Magnus was hesitant to allow black into a 2 bishops versus bishop and knight scenario, which black would have the option of doing that if white played bishop d1 immediately. So Magnus first plays f5. Now bishop c6 as advertised. And now he does play bishop d1. Probably he was happy with the slight progress he's made by putting the pawn on f5. At least he's gaining some space, and black was forced to put his bishop here. And, you know, it was probably slightly tempting to take this bishop here, but to Fabiano's credit, he plays in more enterprising fashion. So he plays bishop b2. And this is a prelude to attacking the pawn on d4, as we'll see. He doesn't hurry to play knight takes a2. First plays this bishop b2 move. Magnus takes the pawn on h5. And now knight e4 check. If knight takes a2, then white can defend the pawn on d4 via bishop a7. And it looks a little bit scary, but Magnus will bring his bishop back to f3 and try to double attack the pawn on d5. Probably white is okay here. So, yeah, instead of going after a2, black now switches plans a little bit. Knight e4 check. That kind of shows why bishop b2 was a nice move. It kept black's options open. Knight e4 check, and then bishop takes d4. So reestablishing the material balance. But now we have a slight imbalance in the pawns, because black has this d-pawn that is passed, and white has a majority over here. And such passed pawns, they're kind of hard to judge because they can be a weakness if they get blockaded or there's not enough support for them. But in the present situation, black has 3 very nicely centralized pieces. One observation that Magnus made about Fabiano before this match is that Fabiano really likes playing in the center. And indeed, we've seen that in a lot of these games. Fabiano is very much a classical player, not only in his openings, but also his love for controlling the center. And he really uses it to great effect. So bishop takes d4. Magnus drops the bishop back to f4 to defend the knight. And now bishop c5. Important that the tactics don't work out for black here. So I remember just thinking, what happens if bishop takes e3? Bishop takes e3, and then this move d4. Trying to open up discovery on the king. Bishop takes d4, and then using the knight to go after the bishop. But fortunately for white, if knight f6, there's bishop f3, blocking the check and saving the bishop. Otherwise, that bishop on h5 would drop. So that tactic is not working. So Fabiano plays bishop c5, withdrawing the bishop and making way for this d-pawn to come up. Magnus plays bishop f3. We're now past time control. I haven't been talking at all about the time usage of the players because the game itself was the more important thing, and the time pressure was, a little less of a factor than in previous games. So we're past move 40 now. Bishop f3. And Fabiano plays this move knight d2. And now here, an important decision for this game. Because Magnus, again, could opt to go for or offer to go into a 2 bishops versus knight and bishop endgame. So he could play knight f1 here, attacking this knight on d2 twice. And after knight takes f3, king takes f3, black might play d4 check. I think white's king is a little bit awkward here. King e2, and now this move bishop e4 seems nice, attacking the pawn. Also maybe playing around with the idea of bishop b1 going after these pawns. And I think Magnus took a glance at these positions and was probably thinking, okay, I'm gonna suffer here. So what he decides to do is sacrifice a minor piece for 3 pawns. So he plays bishop takes d5 when his bishop is attacked. Now, in the press conference after the game, Magnus admitted that he miscalculated this line. He thought he was getting 3 full pawns, and he was going to be able to keep these 3 full pawns. However, we'll see that he loses at least one of them right away in this endgame. And now the following line is forced. So Fabiano played bishop takes e3, removing the defender of the bishop on d5. Magnus played bishop takes c6. Otherwise, if he takes here, bishop takes d5 check, and that's only 1 pawn for the piece. White doesn't have time to take the knight. So he must play bishop takes c6. And now bishop takes f4, continuing this chain reaction. Bishop takes b7. Again, got to be careful about the move order. If white takes this bishop, then black gets a chance to take here. Only 1 pawn for the piece. This is an easy win for black with the extra knight. So bishop takes b7. Now black has to waste time saving this attacked bishop. So bishop to d6. Bishop takes a6. So this is the position both sides envisioned a few moves back when white had this option, and Magnus went for it. So yeah, Magnus thought he would be able to keep his extra pawns here. He's got 2 pawns connected on the queen side and an extra pawn over here, 3 versus 2. But Fabiano quickly demonstrated that that is not the case. So he played a nice centralizing move, knight e4, attacking the pawn on g3. And I think if you're white and you're trying to play this in the best way, you're not going to want to give up the g-pawn. It's possible to play like a4 here if white wants to start advancing on the queen side. But I think after knight takes g3, you're going to have to defend the pawn on f5 because knight takes f5 is a threat. So bishop d3, black can play knight h5. This knight is soon going to get back in the game via one of these squares. Also, black can try to blockade these pawns with bishop b4. Note that knight f4 is a threat, forking the king and the bishop, so white doesn't have time to start rolling these pawns yet. I don't think this is a very practical way to play this, although even here, I'm not 100% sure black can win this position. Your engine will say that black is better, but is it a win? Hard to say. But it seems to me that a human wants to keep those pawns connected. So keeping that g-pawn is critical for white. It's much harder for black to attack 3 connected pawns like that versus a situation where you only have to attack the f and the h pawn if you're black. So g4 is understandable. But now again, this bishop a3 move is a move Magnus missed. It's a very nice move. Immediately putting the brakes on the pawns. And now Magnus cannot defend the a2 pawn. Or if he wants to defend the a2 pawn, he'll have to lose his b pawn because black is threatening knight c3, attacking a2. And note that even if white knows that that's a threat, you can't get the bishop anywhere that's going to hold it because when the knight comes to c3, once more, the b1 square is unavailable for the bishop. So now we get into a very interesting stage of the game. So Magnus played bishop c4. And now before playing the knight in, Fabiano first plays king f8. It's a very professional move that sidesteps any attempts by white to play g5, g6 and use this pin pawn. And he knows that pawn on a2 isn't running away anywhere. So Magnus pushes. White is definitely playing for a draw here. He's going to drop that one of the pawns on the queen side. His best chance to make a draw is to try to trade off black's remaining pawns. If he can trade off black's remaining pawns, then it's virtually a guaranteed draw so long as he doesn't lose his bishop outright. The pawns are definitely what you need to eliminate if you're white. So g5, advancing a little bit closer. And now Fabiano goes for the a pawn, knight c3. And Magnus decides that he wants to give up the b pawn instead, so he plays b4, allowing the bishop to defend the a2 pawn. Fabiano captures the b pawn, thank you very much. Now Magnus brings up his king. And Fabiano starts circling around here. He plays knight a4. He's going to improve his knight a little bit, plays his knight to c5. It's hard for white to go for trades too fast here. You don't want to lose your flexibility with these pawns, so it's smart of Magnus to avoid playing f6 or g6 too soon. If these pawns get blockaded, so if ever something like g6, f6 is played, I think that greatly increases the chance that white will lose, because the only weakness black has is g7. Black can start maneuvering, and the brakes will be put on the h and the a pawns very quickly. Likewise, f6 is virtually unthinkable because there's probably an option for black just to take and then go after the f6 pawn, especially if your king doesn't support it. That's not going to be a good option. So after the knight repositions itself to c5 rather, Magnus plays a4, getting his a pawn going. I'm not completely sure if Magnus should advance this a pawn. It's a bit open to interpretation. I actually don't think it would really matter one way or the other, so I'm not going to criticize that move. A4. And now Fabiano plays f6. So I just said that Fabiano would like to keep pawns on the board, so why play this f6 move? Well, it's hard to make progress otherwise. He does need to create some targets. And he can't just blindly move his king up, because then white's h-pawn could become dangerous if ever h5, h6 could be played. Pushing this pawn does allow black to start trying to control even the dark squares even further and try to blockade white's pawns. And this tension created on the g5 square actually favors black. So f6 is a good idea. And now Magnus played king g4. He's going to try to stay close to this pawn mass here. Also might be possible to play king e2, which is a very weird looking move. I could completely understand why Magnus didn't play this move. One virtue of king e2, though, is it does stop bishop e1. if black ever wants to try to swing the bishop over here and attack h4, which is what he does when white goes to g4. But yeah, this feels like a computer move. I think king g4 as Magnus plays is much more interesting and good, practical move. So king g4, and now Fabiano plays knight e4. He doesn't need his knight to stop the queenside pawn. All he needs is his bishop guarding the a5 square. So he's going to improve his knight. Magnus brings his king in, king h5. And now this bishop e1 move. Magnus plays bishop to d3, attacking the knight. Knight to d6. And now here, Magnus made a very bold decision. And this is right before the second time control, so we're coming up on move 60 now. The players got, I believe, an additional 50 minutes after reaching move 40, and at move 60, they get an additional 15 with a 30-second increment throughout. So he makes a bold decision, but I actually think in analyzing this endgame, he would be forced to play this move eventually anyways. So he plays a5, which looks like a bizarre move because it gives up the a-pawn for seemingly nothing. But the reason he does this is to get his king to g6. He buys a little bit of time by deflecting the black bishop, and he can get his king into g6, where white has a much better chance of being able to trade off black's remaining pawns. And remember, if white ever takes here, then black will be looking to preserve this last pawn, and he stands a very good chance of doing that, as the game continuation will demonstrate, because it's on a dark square. If ever the king comes up, bishop takes h4 can be played. We'll get to these scenarios in a second. But a5, crafty move, giving the pawn, but being able to play king g6 very soon. First, he does trade on f6. I should point out that if king g6 is played here first before the trade, then bishop d8 is a nice option for black. And if you have to take and black is able to take with the bishop, that is going to win a lot easier for black because, again, these pawns are split up. They lose a lot of their momentum. And if h6 is played, black can play knight f7, and white is not going to be able to play h6 successfully. Even though white looks aggressively placed here, they're going to get pushed back very soon. Knight e5 is a big threat in this position. So note that Magnus trades on f6 at a moment when black can't take with the bishop. So trade, and now he gets the king into this aforementioned square, the g6 square, vital. But at this point, white only has one pawn for the piece because his queenside is gone. His 3 versus 2 is now a 2 versus 1. So only one pawn for the piece. And he really would like to eliminate this pawn if possible, but black is going to do everything in his power to prevent that. So now here, Fabiano played bishop to d8. And some of the commentators were surprised by that because black could also play bishop to c3. I actually don't think this would affect the result of the game if bishop c3 is played. But Fabiano decides to play bishop d8 instead. And now Magnus plays an excellent move. And I want to say, right as we get into this endgame, because we're getting into the meat and potatoes of this game, even though we're now on move 60, this is an incredibly complex endgame. And kind of the Cliff Notes version that you're seeing me present with the aid of the engine and also knowing what some other people have said about this endgame, it doesn't do justice at all to the fact that these decisions over the board in such a high pressure, intense situation are so difficult. So I just wanted to point that out. I think Magnus's next move is a brilliant move. Alex Yermolinsky says this is a double exclam move. And Magnus envisioned this and this whole idea when he was playing a5 and giving up that a-pawn. So he plays king h7. Because it turns out that stopping black from playing king g8 and getting his king to the corner is absolutely crucial for white in this endgame. So king h7, voluntarily stepping away from his f-pawn and seemingly locking his king in on the edge of the board. But it's that important to stop black from getting to the corner. If you just blindly advance your h-pawn here, which appears to be white's only asset, I mean, you might think maybe he should just put it to use. Here's a demonstration of what can happen. There are some Zugzwang themes. So king g8, black again trying to get to the corner. h6, king h8. And let's say white just waits now, bishop to c2. Black can start pivoting with this knight. So when this bishop moves off the d3 square, the knight gets a lot of freedom. Some square has to be given up. So here, and black can pivot around to e5 check. And that e5 check is very annoying. The king is going to be forced backwards. There's no forward square for the king. Black's bishop holding this pawn. So king h5, and then king h7 can be played. and this h6 pawn will eventually be lost. For instance, let's say bishop c2, black can just start working the bishop around to e3 and take the pawn on h6 next. And if that happens, black is winning. So that's why utterly critical for Magnus to play the move that he played and appreciated, king h7. Now the big question in this endgame, can black win this? He's working with not a whole lot of material, but white only does have one pawn for the piece. To win this endgame, black needs to win the h-pawn. It's critical to do that, because if he wins the h-pawn and the material stays the same, then he can eventually win the f-pawn, even if white gives up the bishop for this pawn when it advances to f5. Mating with king, bishop, and knight against king is easy for these guys. Some grandmasters have blown it, but Fabiano and Magnus are not going to blow king, bishop, and knight against king. That's a theoretical win for the side with the bishop and the knight, just to be absolutely clear. So that's the scenario white has to avoid. So now knight f7 was played. Magnus played bishop to c4, knight e5, bishop d5. Bishop a5 was played. There's no longer a real compelling reason for black to keep his bishop here defending this pawn, because with the knight maneuver to e5, black is controlling the g6 square. So bishop a5. And now Magnus plays h5. Okay, so let's pause here. We're on move 64. I spent a good deal of time analyzing this endgame, and again, caveat, this is with the benefit of the engine, other analysts. I tried to distill this down to something that I could understand and what I might be able to pass along to you guys. Now, I believe black can win this endgame if one of the following three conditions is met. One or multiple of these conditions. And I'm going to read them off because I wrote them down. If black can get his king to h8, which I've already touched on, if black can get the king to the corner, if white is forced to play h6, and black doesn't have to sacrifice a pawn for it, that's a separate condition. So in this endgame, if white is ever forced to play h6 and black doesn't have to sacrifice a bishop or a knight for it, I believe black can win. And then the third condition is if white's bishop gets stuck defending the f-pawn from a short diagonal, specifically this diagonal here. So if the bishop is stuck on g4 or h3. And I know that sounds pretty abstract at the moment, but hopefully with some of the lines I'm going to show, I'm going to illustrate how these scenarios could come about. So just to reiterate that, I think black can win if one of the following three things happens. If black can get his king to h8, if white is forced to play h6 when black can't sacrifice a piece for it, and or white's bishop gets stuck defending the f-pawn from g4 or h3. There's probably some exceptions to that. This is a very, very difficult ending to analyze, and this game is only a few hours old. But it seems to me if one of those things happens, the chances that black wins goes way up. And I don't know if white is able to defend. Now, I think white can defend this, but it takes a ton of precision, and we will see that Magnus slips up. So the pawn on h5 is fine, but white should definitely not look to advance the pawn to h6. I think both players understood that because h6 creates a target. That pawn is on a dark square, and in a lot of cases, it boxes white's king in as well. So let's continue. Fabiano plays bishop to d2. And now Magnus just waits with his bishop, bishop a2. He's voluntarily entombed his king, but that's key because it's hard for black to make progress here. And again, don't want to push the pawn h6. That would immediately lose after knight g4 in this position, double attacking this pawn. So bishop to a2 was played. And now Fabiano starts maneuvering with this fabled knight in this game, knight f3. Magnus goes to d5, attacking the knight. Knight to d4. And now king g6. Okay, so we're only a few moves into this situation with the pawn on h5, but this caused quite a stir in everyone who was following this game live, because king g6 appears to lose the game, based on very deep computer analysis. It's the decisive mistake, and in fact, the only mistake I could find in white's play in this game that leads to a loss. So Fabiano has been outplaying Magnus in the game, but king g6 is the one move that we can pinpoint that actually does give it away. But the win is extremely difficult for black to find, and Fabiano did not manage to find it during the game. So white needed to play bishop e4. That was the better option. Defending the pawn on f5. And just as a sample line here, black can play knight e2, bishop d3, knight f4. Black's going to try to wheel around and attack this pawn. But a big saving resource for white in this endgame is that white can often ignore the attack on the pawn. Again, remember I was saying that he doesn't want to advance it to h6. Here the bishop is even under attack, so moving it to h6 would not be good. But one saving resource that comes up time and time again is if black can play knight takes h5, they're thinking they're going to win, but white has king g6 attacking the knight and the f-pawn. And in doing so, white will win that f-pawn and save the game. So it appears that black can't crack this in this particular line. Just a sample line, bishop c3, bishop d1, now defending this pawn. And the game will continue from here, but white's king is still on h7. Black hasn't met any of those conditions that I laid out. It appears that white can hold. So that was in the case that in this position here on move 67, white plays bishop e4 instead of king g6. Now let's go into why king g6 is losing, because this is pretty interesting. And now one thing I want to mention, along with those conditions I laid out, the black knight getting to e2 is a big gain for black if black can accomplish that, because after coming to e2, the knight can come to one of these two squares, either f4 or g3. And that's a significant problem for white in many variations. Not every variation, but in a lot of them, that's an issue. So on king g6, the critical move is bishop g5, as played by Fabiano. So far, he's following the winning line. And now Magnus played bishop c4, which defends this critical e2 square. And here's where the very powerful engine SES, which is that Norwegian, what I call the supercomputer, which, as I've come to learn, is actually just Stockfish running on a bunch of cores, but a lot of cores. It was claiming that black has a checkmate in 36 moves here. And this is a product of that king g6 decisive mistake. So Fabiano played knight f3 in this position, but bishop h4 is in fact the winning move. And let's explore why. So white can play bishop d5. What black is trying to do with bishop h4 is eventually put white in zugzwang. So bishop d5 is one of the critical variations. If h6, trying to advance the pawn, then that's already dangerous based on one of the conditions that we laid out. Black can play knight f3. And on h7 check, it looks like white is doing pretty well, because knight e5 check, white can go here and attack the bishop. But the problem is black plays king g7, stopping the pawn from queening. And due to the unfortunate placement of the bishop on c4, white loses. White doesn't have time to pick up this bishop, because takes, black will preserve this pawn, eliminate the h-pawn, and win the game by eventually winning the f-pawn. So bishop h4, h6 is not a good idea, even though it kind of looks like the pawn could slip through. Let's examine that critical move, bishop d5. Now black can start maneuvering, knight e2, again trying to get within striking distance of this and this square. Now two main moves possible here, either king h7 or bishop f3. Let's look at king h7 first, because this is consistent with what Magnus has been doing in this endgame in an attempt to defend. And I think in the press conference, both the players were kind of analyzing this after being informed by a journalist that this bishop h4 move was winning. So king h7, and watch how black can crack this eventually. Bishop g5, bishop f3, knight g3, attacking the pawn on f5, bishop g4. And note that the bishop has been forced to this bad square. And that's critical because after king f7, it would be really nice if white could check the king. If white could deliver a check on this diagonal, they would be able to defend and then bring the king to this square. But not so in this case. The bishop is stuck on a very bad square. It can't even move, because if it moves, one of these pawns will drop off. So white is forced to move the king, and then the bishop can reroute itself, assuming white is trying to avoid playing h6, which will result in the pawn eventually being lost. The bishop can route itself back here, and this is a nice little variation. Knight e4, and it's checkmate in 2 because of knight g5 check, king h8, and bishop g7. We just illustrate that line. Or it'll be checkmate in a few, I guess. White can throw in a few checks, but eventually this will happen, and white has lost the h-pawn. So backing up a little bit, that's what can happen if white goes into the corner. So that was here on move 70 in this hypothetical line. Bishop h4, bishop d5, knight e2 if white goes to the corner. King h7, he eventually gets put in zugzwang because this knight is coming to this critical g3 square, forcing bishop g4. And the fact that white can't deliver the check from that diagonal is key. Another variation that we should definitely look at is bishop f3. I think this was the main line given by Cess, leading to this win in 36 moves. So this is really nice, this line. So bishop f3 attacking the knight. Black gets to play this move, knight g1. Pretty surprising, knight g1, which succeeds in forcing white's bishop to this square. If the bishop goes back to d5, I believe the problem is knight here, and then a check can be delivered on this f4 square, which is big. That'll be similar to the lines we just looked at, actually. So knight g1, bishop g4, mission accomplished for black. As far as our conditions, the bishop has been forced to this poor square, but black's knight is trapped. Watch how black can get himself out of this predicament. So king g8, now black has access to the corner. King h6, let's say white's being stubborn. This bishop can maneuver itself. The pawn on f6 is no longer attacked. King g6, let's defend it from a different angle. King h6, white's just going to wait. Bishop check, king g6, bishop g5, again from a different angle. Black is defending. And this is a zugzwang. If white moves the bishop, then black's knight is going to get to the f4 square and win. So white must push the pawn here. And now black waits, king h8. h7 could be played. Bishop h4. Waiting once again. King here. Black maneuvers the bishop. Defend from a different angle. Check. And now bishop g5. And finally, white is in zugzwang for the last time, and he'll have to lose material as a result. There's just no good move here. If king f7, then black can take on h7, and black will eventually win the f-pawn. Again, a bishop move can be met by the knight eventually getting to f4 because white must give up one of these two squares. White could play something like bishop h5 just as an example, knight h3, bishop g4, knight f4 check, king's forced to move, take, and at long last, black has won this pawn and will eventually win the game. So let's back up again just to see if there's any other lines that are worth exploring here. This is so inhuman and such a difficult piece of calculation that it's completely understandable that neither side was able to identify why this was a win. But as far as I can tell, one of these conditions is going to be met, and black will win the game. Mostly white's pawn being forced to advance, like that pawn eventually being forced to h6, and also the bishop having to come over here. In fact, in that last line, you saw all three of the conditions being met. So there's some positions where to crack white's setup there, you need to get your king to h8, you need to force that pawn forward, and at the beginning of that sequence, you need to have forced white's bishop to g4 and put white in zugzwang with all those bishop moves we were saying. Just crazy. I think I got all the lines here, but before... yeah, I kind of hit the major lines. Bishop d5, as I said, after bishop h4 was a critical variation. I also looked at like bishop f1. White can try various bishop moves here. Bishop f1, if you ever abandon this diagonal, then black's going to hustle over with the king. King g8, h6. Black starts maneuvering. Put the king on h8. This is real similar. Yeah, and that pawn on h7 is eventually going to be lost. Black can always play this and this and this if necessary. Go pick it up. Yeah, just one more variation, maybe bishop h4. Let's say white plays bishop a2, just toggling to a different square on this diagonal. Knight comes to e2. Again, you can see the importance of this e2 square. I know Peter Svidler was talking about this in his chess 24 analysis. Black just gains a lot of opportunities with the knight coming to e2. Just as an example, h6, check, king here, bishop g5, and that pawn will be quickly lost because black can play knight g2 to e3 and then to g4 and finally take it. Or if white is trying to cover the g4 square, we'll win f5 and then win h6. So I apologize if I'm going too far into the weeds or it appears that way, you're getting confused. There's no other way to analyze this endgame. This is just incredibly complicated, but this was the moment where bishop h4 was winning via very complex sequences where white is eventually forced to destroy their own position. Really, they get put in zugzwang many times. But instead, Fabiano played knight f3. Contains the threat of knight e5 check, which would be a fork on the king and the bishop. But that allows the king back to h7 under acceptable circumstances for white. So knight e5 is played here, bishop b3, now knight g4. Magnus waits, bishop c4. Knight e3, double attack the bishop and the pawn. So now Magnus switches it up a little bit, plays bishop d3. And now knight g4. I suppose he could try king f7 right here, because for the moment, white is unable to deliver a check on c4 due to the knight covering this square. But the fact that white is defending from this diagonal, I think, is very important, and probably bishop b1 would be the answer. Threatening bishop a2 check. Yeah, and that king will be forced off of f7. So that's no improvement either. So Fabiano played knight g4 here. Magnus played bishop c4. Knight h6. King g6. And now something that was pointed out on the Chess 24 broadcast. If knight g4 was played, then by writing down the move king h7, Magnus could actually claim a 3-position repetition draw. This position was repeated on moves, if white plays king h7, that would have been a repetition on moves 71, 73, and now here on 75. So I don't know if both players realize that or not. Fabiano didn't play knight g4, but he's finding it hard to create any damage with this knight or put white in zugzwang, get the h-pawn to advance, get his king to the corner, force white's bishop to g4. None of those situations which we analyze with bishop h4 are really possible at this point. So king e7 was played, and Fabiano is going to try to work his king out, actually, and try to get around and attack the pawns from a different direction, because this is all real solid. White is unable to move the h-pawn with black constantly guarding the h6 square, overprotecting. And at first sight, this seems kind of dangerous, but both players realize that this is a fortress. So this is the game continuation. We're on move 76 now. Bishop c2, king e5. Bishop d3, white waiting and defending the pawn here. King f4, bishop c2. A couple different attempts here. Fabiano played knight g4, moving the knight. King g4 is interesting. So maybe with the idea of putting the king here and then knight g4 and then knight e5 check and trying to eventually win the pawn on h5, but just a way white could defend bishop d1 check, king h4, and now I think white can just wait with bishop e2, because if knight g4 is ever played in this situation, white makes a draw in a nice way. They can play bishop takes g4, king takes g4, h6, and that pawn's going to score a touchdown if black doesn't sack for it. And then you don't take the bishop, you take the pawn at the very end. Key. Don't let them play king takes h6, king takes f5 and win the game. Take the pawn instead. So that was a nice little drawing variation that was possible if black brings the king around to h4. Otherwise, if black plays knight g8 here, trying to get the knight out this way and maybe win the f5 pawn, there's a nice tidy way to keep black under wraps here. King f7 attacking the knight, which doesn't really have a lot of squares to go to. It can only go back to h6 safely. So knight h6, king g6 would produce the same position, and yeah, black can't make progress here. So on bishop c2, Fabiano did not move his king over there. He played knight g4. Magnus waited, bishop to b3. Knight e3. Note that knight e5 check followed by king takes f5 is possible, but that will require black to sacrifice the bishop for the pawn, which we said is not good. If white can play h6, but black has to sack the bishop for it, then black is unlikely to win, because if we get this situation, all white has to do is give up the bishop for the pawn, which is possible if black tries to start advancing it. So knight e5 tempting there, but it doesn't work. So knight e3 was played. Again, like, what else does black do? It seems like eventually to make progress, he's going to have to use his king and his knight to attack that pawn. But in doing so, he lets the h-pawn run. So knight e3, and Magnus immediately jumped on the chance to play h6. And now Fabiano played bishop takes h6. And at this point, this 6.5-hour game was agreed drawn, ending a titanic struggle. Bishop takes h6. White can make a draw in two different ways here. I was actually thinking, if I were playing this game, which one I would choose. You can take the bishop or take the pawn. I think probably they would take the bishop, and a little bit of care is required here just to make sure that you can sack the bishop for the pawn eventually. White's king is a little bit offsides, but it is a draw. White could also make a draw, though, by playing king takes f6, and if we get this endgame, even though king, bishop, and knight versus king is a win, so long as white doesn't blunder their bishop or get some ridiculously bad position, like stuck in a corner, that they will draw this game. But this maybe could drag it out, because with an extra piece, I bet Fabiano would play for a little bit. So yeah, king takes h6, on the other hand, would probably make a fairly routine draw. So 80 moves, game ends up being drawn. Let me put up the scores at long last, halfway through this 12-game match. It's 3-3, all draws, but wow, this game was super interesting to analyze. I had a little bit more time to analyze this game versus game 1, which was 115 moves, but yeah, I've been looking at this endgame quite a bit today since it was played, and this is a fascinating one. This will go in the history books as one of the most beautiful, complex endgames ever played in World Championship history. And that critical moment, if we want to choose a few things to sum up in this game, that critical moment right here where the engine Cess was saying bishop h4 was a win, the players admitted in the press conference that they don't understand why that's the case. And if the top players in the world are saying they don't understand, even after being told why this move is winning, they don't understand why that's the case, then that tells you the difficulty of it. And I tried to distill some of the variations down, but again, I believe it comes down to white either eventually having to move the h-pawn, let black's king into h8, or force white's bishop to h4 to the g4 square, which is bad for white. One or all of those things appears to be happening after this bishop h4 move, and black can win in an inhuman way. But the correct result of this endgame is a draw. And Fabiano said as such in the press conference. He said, it's kind of accidental. He said accidental that I got winning chances here. I think both players recognize that. In fact, Magnus found a brilliant idea with king h7. Like this idea of sacrificing the queenside pawns, especially that a5 move, and then voluntarily putting your king on h7. But it was brilliant. It stopped black's king from coming over. And you're not trying to advance your h-pawn. You're just putting it on h5 and asking black to crack this fortress. Another famous thing Magnus has said in his match against Karyakin is that he doesn't believe in fortresses. But he was asked in the press conference, like, what do you think about fortresses now? And he said, well, I'm glad they exist. And understandably so. So fascinating game, even though it started as a Petrov, traditionally pretty drawish opening, and looked pretty drawish in the middle game. I totally thought after the rooks were traded right around here, I wasn't analyzing the game too closely. I was just following it on my phone, and I thought, okay, it looks 3 minor pieces each, nearly symmetric pawn structure. When are they going to shake hands? And we're going to have another draw that people are going to be screaming about for lack of entertainment. But no, these guys really delivered, and bravo to Magnus and Fabiano, because this was a fun game to analyze, and I hope it was a fun game for you guys to analyze and watch as well. So thank you guys. Appreciate you following my coverage here. Just a reminder, I am going to London myself in a few days. I leave on Monday, so I don't know how many more game reviews I'll be able to do. I might do some videos while I'm there, but this might be my last extensive recap of a game in this match while the match happens. I will be doing the rest day coverage tomorrow on my Twitch channel. Tomorrow, as in November 17th. It starts at 12 o'clock p.m. noon Central Time, which is 1800 GMT. So if you want to see me recap these games in possibly greater detail and also ask me some questions, I would love to have you guys ask me questions. It's primarily for that. So I hope to see you there. And thanks again, guys. This is a fascinating match, even though all games have been drawn. Let's see what happens in the second half of the match. Magnus says white again in game 7. All right, bye, guys.